Friends, today I'm going to discuss a book called Exterminate All the Brutes, One Man's Odyssey into the Heart of Darkness and the Origins of European Genocide by Sven Lindqvist, a Swedish writer. I first became acquainted with his work when I picked up a copy about maybe 20 years ago of a book he wrote called A History of Bombing, which I will discuss separately. It's a work deserving considerable attention, and so I don't really want to lump it with this book, but both that book and Exterminate All the Brutes share something in common. And one of the things they share in common is a very distinctive style that Lindqvist has developed as his own. So the book consists of a number of chapters, but the chapters have numbered paragraphs or numbered sections, and these are numbered consecutively from the beginning of the work until the very end. This is something that is common to both this book and A History of Bombing. What is really distinctive about A History of Bombing, I just mentioned it at this point to, I hope, make you feel intrigued by the totality of his work, not just the book that I'm going to be discussing, excuse me, today. What is distinctive about that book is that at the end of each paragraph, what he does is he gives you a series of numbers. So let's say, for example, that paragraph 34 is on the bombing of the Pathans by the British. That is the bombing of what was called the Northwest Frontier Province during the period of late colonialism in South Asia. So the bombing of the Pathans by the British in 1919. And let's supposing that's paragraph 34. So at the end of each paragraph, what the author does is he gives you a series of numbers. Some numbers go back, some numbers go forward. So 34 may list 72 because that might be an episode which is an episode about the bombing of Afghanistan by the Americans, or there may be a paragraph, let's say paragraph 60, which might be the bombing of Afghanistan by the Soviets when there was a Soviet invasion. And of course, if there's an atomic bombing, such as the bombing at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, there may be a paragraph about the contemplated nuclear bombing of Vietnam or Korea by the Americans, right? So there are several ways to read the book. You don't have to read it consecutively from the first page until the very end. Of course, many of us don't read books that way anyhow. We sometimes skim books, we skip chapters altogether. But the point is that he actually, in a manner of speaking, really gives you different ways to think about the book. Now, Exterminate All the Brutes is a book that can be seen as, perhaps for those of you who heard my previous discussion of Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, can be seen as perhaps something of a continuation of that style of thinking, although I think that this book is of a rather different tenor. I think its conclusions are not very different than the conclusions that Césaire reached in Discourse on Colonialism. This phrase "exterminate all the brutes," it's in quotation marks. It's in quotation marks because it's actually a phrase from Herbert Spencer, a 19th century English intellectual, known principally as a kind of a neo-Darwinian, someone who really believed that human existence is nothing else really fundamentally except the struggle to survive, right? So it's a jungle out there. It's a jungle out there. This is, of course, putting it very colloquially, but that's really what Herbert Spencer stood for. He stood for the idea that the strong people who are intellectually more developed will outlive the others, right? And That's one of the consequences of evolution. Now, what is the general argument of this book and what is its narrative structure apart from the numbered paragraphs that I've mentioned? So there are really essentially three narratives here. Two of them can be considered smaller narratives, and then you have the large narrative, which binds together the whole book. That large narrative is about the European project of extermination, because Lindqvist, a Swedish writer, and the Swedes, of course, did not have the kind of colonial empires that the British and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese earlier on, or the Dutch had. Right? But Lindqvist is very clear that whether you come from Italy or you come from Britain or France or Germany or Sweden or Denmark, there is something that lies at the heart of all of Europe. And what lies at the heart of Europe is the idea of extermination. The idea of extermination, he says on page 9, lies no further from the heart of humanism than Buchenwald lies from the Goethe house in Weimar, right? It's a juxtaposition which is very, very important, because Buchenwald is, of course, a metaphor here for Nazi extermination, right? For concentration camps. And he says it lies not very far, so to speak, right, from Goethe house, the house where Goethe was born. So in Weimar, in Germany. And Goethe, of course, is seen as one of the supreme representatives of the tradition of European humanism. Right? So the question that really became the pressing question for many people in the West, following what happened in Nazi Germany and the perpetration of the Holocaust, and of course Hitler's grand design for world domination. Right? And the question that was at the forefront for many people was, well, how is it that Germany, which has gifted to the world the music of Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Schumann, Mozart, right, from where the most celebrated philosophers, Kant, Hegel, Schiller, Schopenhauer, and of course, some of the most gifted writers, once again, Schiller, Goethe, and in more recent years, Günter Grass, but this, of course, would be anachronistic because Günter Grass was not really, an active writer, of course, at the time of the Holocaust. But the point is simply this, that the question was, how did a civilization of this kind at the same time generate the concentration camps? Right? And so this is why he puts it in this particular fashion. The idea of extermination lies no further from the heart of humanism. Humanism, the humanism of Goethe, that Buchenwald lies from the Goethe house in Weimar. That insight has been almost completely repressed, even by the Germans, who have been made sole scapegoats for ideas of extermination that are actually a common European heritage. And I think that this should disabuse anyone of the idea that his framing right at the outset, that what he is attempting to do, what Lindqvist is attempting to do, is some kind of partial exoneration of the Germans by suggesting that, well, they were merely scapegoated. No, what he is saying is that, in fact, the responsibility for everything that has happened throughout the course of colonialism, and this book is focused in particular on the 19th century, that responsibility lies not just with Germany, right? It lies with other European powers, including, and we should mention this specifically, the United Kingdom, Britain. Because there is, a game that many scholars unfortunately continue to play today. And that's one of the things that Lindqvist is really saying without putting it in so many words. And that game is distinguishing between good and bad colonialisms. How many times have I heard myself in no less a place than India from certain people. I won't say that that's the majority view, but from certain people that, well, you know, the English did bring in the railways, they brought law and order. Right? These were the telegraph line. They brought us the institution of parliamentary politics, right? And our idea of the Constitution, even though Britain itself does not have a written constitution, but of course that's, in a manner of speaking, a kind of technicality, because the notion of a constitution here is wrapped up with ideas of liberty of speech, freedom of expression. And so many Indians have said that, well, these are some of the things that we inherited from Britain. Yes, they committed the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and those who are really in the know that that was really, in fact, in a manner of speaking, a drop in the ocean. Because what about all the famines that took place in the colonial period, leaving behind millions of dead, millions, right? That half century from 1870 to 1920 that I've often characterized as a half century of catastrophic death, right? So the British were responsible for that too. And what Lindqvist is saying, let's be certain that we understand that the fundamental problems of colonialism and what informed colonialism, such as structural notions of racism, that the British were complicit in this at least as much as the Germans were. And it is in this respect he's saying that the Germans have been scapegoated as particularly evil in some sense. And of course, this was partly the line of thinking that the British had developed for a very long period of time, right? That the kind of atrocities that the Germans, the Huns, were capable of is something that the good old English weren't, right? Because after all, English colonialism really was nothing more than just a Sunday picnic. So this is, and he begins with that extermination lies at the heart of Europe, and he will really conclude with that finding, relentlessly so. Right? So that's the main narrative. And in the course of developing the narrative, what he does is he looks at, for example, in the second half of the book, he looks really at as what the Germans were doing in Africa, European explorers, but he also looks at the ways in which the English connived at what we might describe as systemic theories of racism, right? So he looks both at the Germans and the English, and there are references as well to the French and to other European explorers. So that's and it is the second half of the book that, in that sense, is perhaps somewhat more gripping. But I mentioned that there are two smaller narratives there. So one narrative is a narrative of the author himself going to Africa, and what he does is he intersperses his own story to a certain extent with the larger story of European colonialism, because he talks about what we might describe as his own brutalization, okay, by, for example, his father. But what he's really describing there is, in a way, the brutalization of children. Okay, the brutalization of people in ordinary everyday life by certain norms of disciplining, as it were, that were common in Europe. So that's one narrative where he goes and looks at contemporary Africa, but this is really interspersed in between the larger narrative. And then there's the third narrative, and that is the narrative of Conrad. And in particular, of course, the story now eminently famous, which I recall, and I'm referring here to The Heart of Darkness, and I recall reading this first reading this about 30, 35 years ago, perhaps even longer, I think about 40 years ago, actually, 40 years ago, and then reading it with Professor Harry Haratunian, who was one of my teachers at the University of Chicago, a very well-known scholar of Japanese history, a course that he taught called History and the Other, along with two other faculty members. And I remember very distinctly both Harry and myself having a conversation about the book more informally and saying, that the idea of the horror that is described, that it didn't seem really much of a horror, that the novel itself seemed to have something like what we might call a jaded quality almost, right? I suppose that this is partly because the novel now itself is well over a century old. And then, of course, it was followed by the kind of atrocities of the 20th century, including the notion of total war. But nonetheless, regardless of one's own view of whether the novel in some ways is sort of jaded a bit, perhaps overwrought in post-colonial studies, everyone seems to be looking at it, and that might be perhaps one of the weaknesses of this book, that the engagement with Conrad perhaps is not so interesting. Intrinsically, it's not so interesting, but I think that what gives it a different flavor here is the manner in which he takes that narrative from the heart of darkness to suggest the heart of darkness that lies within European civilization, right? That's what he's really doing. And what he's suggesting is that our unwillingness, particularly in Europe, in the West more generally, in the United States, in the predominantly white countries, to acknowledge what colonialism wrought, right? What were its catastrophic consequences for people all over the world? He's saying that this unwillingness is still at the heart of European civilization. So the argument that Césaire made in Discourse on Colonialism is an argument that we might say in some ways is extended by Lindqvist in this book. Now, in developing his argument, he does a number of things. So he looks really at concrete instances of what Europeans were doing in Africa. He looks at, for example, the highly asymmetrical battles that were fought by colonial forces and Africans. We have instances of 10,000 Africans being wiped out by a few machine guns. There's a wonderful book by John Ellis, The Social History of the Machine Gun, which I hope to discuss in the months ahead. A book that I've used quite frequently when I've taught a class on contemporary world history. So, he has a long discussion of the particular ways in which the Europeans acquired superiority using guns. A somewhat more detailed description. Detailed here is relative because the book is about 175 pages in length, so it's not a very long work. But he describes the significance of the Battle of Omdurman. Looks in Sudan, and he looks at, for example, the kind of narrative that Churchill himself had given us of some of these colonial wars, many of which are wars in which Churchill himself played a role. But what I really want to spend a little bit of time on before bringing this discussion to a conclusion is what he calls not simply the inevitability of extermination. And what he means by the inevitability of extermination is that everything in European policy and the kind of intellectual world, the intellectual milieu from which the Europeans came, tended in the direction of making extermination the only logical outcome of European expansion. So on page 123, the edition here I'm using, it's the only edition that I know of in English, although I know that three or perhaps two of his books were also published in an omnibus edition. But as a standalone book, translated from the Swedish by Joan Tate, Lindqvist's book was published by the New Press in New York and London. And in this edition, on page 123, he has been discussing the anthropologist J.C. Pritchard, who had come to the conclusion that, quote, the savage races couldn't be saved, right? He gave a lecture on the extinction of human races in 1838. And the view that Pritchard took was that because these races couldn't be saved, the anthropologists had a moral obligation to collect as much evidence as they could about their customs, right? Their customs, their manners, their languages. I shall return to this extraordinary point in just a moment, but this is what Lindqvist says then. The threat of extermination provided motivation for anthropological research, which in exchange gave the exterminators an alibi by declaring extermination inevitable. Inevitable. And one of the remarkable things about this book, despite its brevity, is the extraordinary research that has really gone into it. And when I say extraordinary research here, I don't mean the sheer number of books. I mean, they don't run into the thousands or even into the several hundreds. But rather, I mean by that he has really looked at the intellectual ethnographic record. You know, all these, many of these now obscure anthropologists, ethnologists, historians, social scientists more broadly of the late 19th century and Germany and England and France, who some of whom were celebrated figures in their own time, right? But now are entirely forgotten. They don't belong in the league of Weber or Marx or Durkheim. Right? That's what I mean by people who have become relatively obscure. That Lindqvist has read all of them, and has certainly been able to extract some of the most relevant passages from many of these works. Right? But this idea, which I've referred to, which goes back to the essay by Pritchard on the extinction of human races, 1838, where Pritchard makes the argument that in the interests of science, it is imperative that anthropologists collect evidence about the physical, moral characteristics of these races, which are going to disappear from the face of the earth. Thank goodness he's saying they are going to, because, well, frankly, they don't really deserve to live. That's what many of these writers said. And even if they deserve to live, unfortunately, such are the laws of social evolution that these people really aren't fit to survive. But nonetheless, it's imperative that we know about them. In fact, we know everything about them to the extent it's possible. Now, this reminds me very much of something that I saw at an exhibition on the Holocaust, the road to the Holocaust, the road to the final solution, as it's called. Now, you know, this is an exhibition I saw in Los Angeles at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the company of Ashish Nandi, whose book, The Intimate Enemy, I had discussed. This is something like about 15, 20 years ago. And what is remarkable about that exhibition, something that I have never forgotten, right, is the following. See, when one sees an exhibition on the Holocaust, so there are now perhaps 100 museums dedicated to the Holocaust all over the world. The United States has several. I've probably been to 7 or 8. Maybe 100 is a bit of a stretch, but there's certainly a couple of dozen at least. And certainly Germany has many. So they all have more or less a similar kind of exhibition. So usually it begins with, some of them will begin with the defeat of Germany at the end of World War I, the reparations that Germany had to pay, the anger that provoked, then the collapse of what seemed like the collapse of Germany at that point. You get the Great Depression. So what's happening in Weimar Germany, all of this is really the beginning. And then the rise of Hitler, the promulgation of the first anti-Semitic legislation in 1933, the Reichstag fire, right? And then eventually the setting up of such concentration camps as Dachau, which was not set up initially, of course, for the Jews. It was set up for political opponents of Hitler, including communists and labor union leaders. So, and then, of course, the onset of World War I, Hitler's grand design for world domination, the Blitzkrieg, and then eventually, of course, if we're really looking at the, an exhibition on the Holocaust, the focus, of course, at that point will then unquestionably be the fate of the Jews, right? Beginning with the anti-Semitic legislation of 1933 and more and more legislation over the following years, the effect of which was to completely segregate the Jews, to make it impossible for them to function in public life, make it impossible for them to work in universities and the professions. They're singling out, and then they're eventually, of course, they're being put into ghettos, right? And of course, I'm not going over, needless to say, all the details, but I'm saying that that's a normal course of an exhibition, which then eventually takes us to the setting up of a vast network of concentration camps and places like Poland and the occupied territories, places that fell under German occupation during the course of World War II, right? Eventually leading to the final solution. Now, what was extraordinary about this exhibition was that at the very end, they had an exhibit which pointed out that though the Germans had a design, an ambition, a wish to eliminate every single Jew from the world if they could do so, began, of course, in Europe itself. Right? That though they had this plan and ambition, they also had an idea that at the end of it, once they had achieved their success, they would build a grand museum of Jewish history and culture in Berlin. And this is bizarre, perverse. The vast majority of people would say, like, why would they want to do that? If you exterminate all the Jews, why would you want to have a museum dedicated to their history and culture? Because, of course, we have to understand, and this is where we go back to the point that Lindqvist is here making when he's citing Pritchard and many others of his ilk, is that there was this idea, an idea that comes from the Enlightenment, that everything is knowable, and what the Europeans would like to do is like to, in fact, have a complete record of all of humanity, including the Jews, it's a little bit like having a fossil record of the dinosaurs. Of course, the implication of this is also that you can't tolerate these people in the flesh. You have to wipe them out, but you can tolerate them, so to speak, in a museum. The sort of thing, of course, that has been done in the United States of America, where the American Indians were rendered invisible. And they're largely invisible even today. And yet, of course, there are many museums dedicated to Native American history and culture, right? Including a grand museum in Washington on the Mall, right? Where there is, of course, another museum to African American history, Museum of Natural History, Air Force Museum, and so on. So Lindqvist is extremely insightful. Now, he doesn't necessarily dwell on all of these ideas at very great length, but he gives you enough to offer a provocation, to make you really think. And in this respect, this is not a standard narrative history of colonialism of the sort that most historians would write. I suspect this is also one reason why historians that I'm aware of don't usually teach books like this. You know, they like a work that gives you a standard kind of account. Well, when I say standard, it need not be ideologically standard. That is, it may be critical of colonialism rather than supportive of it in some fashion or the other by trying to distinguish what was good or bad in colonialism. Right? That even the critical accounts tend to give it in a kind of, there's a temporal history, there's a standard way of documenting things. Okay? And of course, very few of the conventional histories will be so radical as to say, as Lindqvist does, that extermination lies at the heart of Europe itself. Right? And just to give a flavor of not only how Lindqvist uses these texts, but his own thinking, right? Let's just take a couple of passages from different European writers of the 19th century. And here I'm deliberately taking English writers rather than German writers, whom he talks about towards the end of the book, but in the second half of the book, well, it's not as though the book is divided into two halves, but I mean in the latter portion of the book. So let's say the last 50 pages, he really does discuss in considerable detail many English writers, right? One of the persons that he brings to the fore is Robert Knox, who was firmly of the view that race, the question of race, was critically important. This is not really the time and place because there are far more detailed works to discuss the time and place to discuss the question of racism. What exactly do we really mean by racism, and at what point did this idea of racism develop? In what ways is it, in fact, actually a distinctly European idea? And I know that my countrymen and women back in India will say, the more liberal ones, the ones who are inclined to suggest that, well, you know, Indians really believe that they have had a tolerant culture, but they've been just as racist as anyone else. Well, I think that we should have some reservations about accepting that view, because yes, there's unquestionably a case to be made for the fact that color consciousness is very important in India. No one who has any detailed knowledge of India can really deny that. But the question is whether that kind of consciousness of color, that distinction, whether that amounts to the same thing as the kind of structural racism that Lindqvist is suggesting, and here I have to very much agree with his view, is in fact entirely intrinsic to European thinking. Right? Okay. So But that's a subject for longer discussion. Here, let us just follow him where he quotes Robert Knox, right? A very influential person in the 19th century. And page 127, paragraph 120. Can the dark races become civilized? I should say not, says Knox. Their future history then must resemble the past, right? So this is, of course, one of the ways in which Europeans colonized notions of time, right? That one of the, we think about colonization also, or fundamentally, I should say rather, very often as something that has a spatial dimension. What this shows very clearly is a temporal dimension, because the people who are colonized, even their future is going to be hijacked. Right? In fact, they don't have really a future, so to speak. Their future history then must resemble the past. The Saxon race, and here I'm quoting Knox, will never tolerate them, never amalgamate, never be at peace. The hottest actual war ever waged, the bloodiest of Napoleon's campaigns, is not equal to that now waging between our descendants in America and the dark races. It is a war of extermination. Extermination. Exterminate all the brutes. Herbert Spencer. It is a war of extermination. Inscribed on each banner is a death's head and no surrender. One or other must fall. Right? And then he goes on to suggest, what is the fate of these people? Look at South Africa. Have we done with the Hottentots and Bosjeman race? I suppose so. They will soon form merely natural curiosities. They're just going to become objects that you put in a museum. Of course, sometimes you displayed Africans. You displayed them as you might display an orangutan in a museum. Right? This was what was done to Truganini, the last Tasmanian, someone that Lindqvist talks about briefly here. And again, in a future talk, I shall have occasion to speak at considerable length about Truganini, about whom I watched a film called The Last Tasmanian in Tasmania itself, when I was in Australia almost 4 decades ago for several months. Right? So, these people will just become curiosities. They will just become curiosities. Now, this Robert Knox is going to appear frequently over the course of the next 20, 30 pages every now and then, because one of the things that Lindqvist is attempting to do is to underscore the importance of racism as an intrinsic aspect of British imperial ideology. Right? So on page 130, he says, time had begun to catch up with Robert Knox. Previously, race had been seen as one of several factors influencing human culture. After Darwin, race became the wholly decisive explanation in far wider circles. Racism was accepted and became a central element in British imperial ideology. And here's another author now. So this is Lord Salisbury, the former Prime Minister of England, who gave a speech at Albert Hall on May 4th, 1898, where he said, one can roughly divide the nations of the world into the living and the dying. How extraordinary a comment. Into the living and the dying, right? So yes, we know which part of the world is dying. It's Africa, it's Polynesia, it's the people living in Tahiti, and of course, people living in other semi-civilized, right? So there was this distinction that was very commonly made between uh, 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 a distinction that ran along three categories of people, according to the anthropologists, social scientists. I use the word social scientists loosely here because the term really wasn't very much in use, if at all, in the 19th century, right? But people who really wrote about evolution, how would one describe Herbert Spencer? So sociologists, anthropologists, ethnographers, um, and philosophers often, right? And what was that tripartite distinction? That they are the savage races, the semi-civilized, and the civilized, right? And what was unequivocally clear to every single person who subscribed to that was that the savage races would almost certainly become extinct. Because even European intervention may not be able to save them. Not that the Europeans were intending to save them, they were more intent on exterminating them, right? But if some had to be saved so that we could have specimens, right? That nonetheless they would become extinct because they weren't evolved enough to survive the rigors of modernity, if I may put it in my language, right? The weak nations become increasingly weaker and the strong stronger, Salisbury went on. It was in the nature of things that, quote, the living nations will fraudulently encroach on the territory of the dying. Right? So here you get this little fraudulently only because, you know, there is a little bit of this self-restraint of the English coming in. Well, it's unfortunate that we have to do this, right? But nevertheless, this is the course of things, right? And yes, I mean, sometimes there was an admission that what we are doing, what we, the English or the Germans or the French are doing, has facilitated the extinction of these people, right? At this point, let us remember that the word genocide had not yet been invented. It would be really the mid 20th century before the word genocide was used. The history of that word and how it first came to be used is something we'll leave aside for the moment. Right? So there are many such writers that he really looks at. And then toward in the last 20 pages or so, he really focuses on Germany, German writers, the particular manner in which German writers supported the whole idea of a hierarchy of races, the superiority of the Europeans, the superiority of the white man, the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon among the white and the Teutonic among the white, right? So even there are different kinds of hierarchies, but yes, you know, those are differences of degree, not a difference of kind. There are differences between the Spaniards and the Portuguese. You know, these Latin people tend to be, according to that conventional way of thinking, they tend to be a little bit tempestuous. They're not so disciplined. Their mental faculties are not that well developed on the whole in comparison to the Lutherans of Germany, right? And one of the interesting things that he points out, that Lindqvist points out, is that Hitler was really a great admirer of English colonialism. I mean, of course, many scholars who really delve deeply into Hitler's life and Nazi ideology are well aware of that, and many of the Nazi ideologues held the same view, right? Um, but Hitler himself was of the view that really the world should be divided between countries that would fall to England under the jurisdiction of England and countries that would fall under the jurisdiction of the Germans. And this whole idea of Lebensraum the idea that the Germans need more room to expand, they need more space, more breathing, living space, because every German is really, in Hitler's view, every Aryan German is saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. You know? The Jews are stifling me, the communists are stifling me. So the knee, of course, many of you will recognize here the metaphor from the events of last year, from the death of Floyd. Right? What happened in Minneapolis? Right? So the provocation here is, so to speak, that what Lindqvist is saying is that it was really the Germans, and when they came up with the idea of Lebensraum, were really saying, I can't breathe. The knee of the Jew, the knee of the communist, the knee of the homosexual, the knee of the Slavs, because Nazi Germany detested Slavs as much as it detested all the others. Right? Their knees are on my neck, and I need breathing room. And so this was, of course, one of the justifications for Hitler's attempted domination of the world. Right? That Germany needs and deserves more land, more space for its own people. So this is the nature of the book that we're talking about. That extermination lies at the heart of Europe.